Zapdos has always been seen as the best legendary bird in competitive Smogon singles, easily outclassing Moltres and, the ice one. But for the first time in 25 years, Moltres is now considered better than Zapdos in the overused tier. Right now, Moltres is thriving using bulky defensive sets that spread burns through Will-O-Wisp or Flame Body, while doubly working as a pivot Pokemon by U-turning on Dragon and Water types that love to come into Moltres. But on the contrary, Zapdos is struggling using its tried and true bulky Volt switching set, and even the offensive Zapdos sets ran on Rain or bulky offense are struggling to dent teams due to what's popular in the current metagame. But to understand what made Moltres better than Zapdos in Scarlet and Violet's OU, we first need to look at why Zapdos was better in the past. In older generations, Zapdos' electric flying type was a huge advantage, while Moltres' fire flying was a big drawback. For example, Zapdos only took 25% damage from Stealth Rock, but Moltres took a massive 50% every time it switched in. This was a big deal because older generations don't have heavy-duty boots to protect against this, making Moltres a risky choice as a defensive Pokemon. Zapdos also had an easier time dealing with the many strong water-type Pokemon in the game. It was able to scare off Suicune and Gyarados pretty effectively, yet on the other hand, Moltres struggled against them really badly. On top of that, Zapdos had access to the better status and paralysis. Back then, electric-type Pokemon could still be paralyzed, Thunder Wave always hit, and being paralyzed reduced speed by 75% instead of 50%. Meanwhile, Moltres had Will-O-Wisp, but it was less accurate and overall less impactful than Paralysis. And even when it came to base stats, Zapdos had the upper hand with a 100 base speed stat, which is more versatile than Moltres' 90 base speed. Other factors like Fire and Grass and Fairy not being an important resistance yet also hurt Moltres in the defensive department. So now you're probably wondering if Moltres was better than Zapdos as an offensive attacker, and to that I say, nope, Zapdos was definitely better than Moltres at that too. That's because Zapdos was given the coverage move of Heat Wave, which paired well with Thunderbolt and Air Slash. Okay, so what coverage move did Moltres get? Zero. It stuck with Air Slash, Flamethrower, and Hidden Power for like ever. And even if Moltres was better offensively than Zapdos, it struggles too much to get in safely because of its times 4 weakness to Stealth Rock. These factors, along with many more, made it extremely difficult for Moltres to compete against Zapdos. But over time, Moltres got some really important buffs. Definitely the biggest was the introduction of heavy-duty boots in Sword and Shield, which is an item that gives immunity to hazards, which completely removed Moltres' weakness to Stealth Rock. Interestingly, Zapdos also uses heavy-duty boots, so for the first time, both Pokemon are now on equal footing in terms of their staying power. Another big improvement for Moltres was getting a strong flying type move, Hurricane, in Generation 5. Zapdos already had a good coverage move with Heat Wave and Discharge, but Moltres having a stronger stat move helps to remedy its lack of coverage. Also, Thunder Wave got nerfed through reduced accuracy, along with electric types becoming immune to paralysis, and most importantly, the speed reduction was nerfed. This made burns almost as valuable as paralysis, especially after Will-O-Wisp became more accurate in X and Y. Moltres' typing also became more useful defensively. Notably, the Fairy type was added in X and Y, which Fire now resists, giving Moltres new defensive utility. Grass types also became a great offensive option with the rise of Superior and Kartana, in addition to new grassy terrain based teams. This obviously benefited the bird that's on fire since, you know, grass doesn't like fire very much. And even better for Moltres, the resistance to fire became very important in Scarlet and Violet due to the rising popularity of sun-based teams. And yes, water types are still common in Gen 9 OU, which is a problem for Moltres. However, most of them hate getting burned or hate being hit by Moltres' powerful hurricanes. And if you still don't like Moltres' fire flying typing, in Gen 9 you can just change its typing with the Terra mechanic, with defensive Terras like Dragon and Fairy being quite popular on Moltres, as it solves all of the original typing's weaknesses. Post-editing scamming here, and I forgot a few things about Moltres. First, Moltres can use Brave Bird over Hurricane to hit Terra Water or Grip on Wellspring. Second, Moltres can use U-turn to pivot out on Dragon and Water types. And finally, Moltres has Roar to phase out incoming attackers, which works especially well in Gen 9, not only because hazards are broken, but you waste the opponent's booster energies too. Also, I put 20 hours into this video, so consider consider subscribing? With many of Moltres' old problems either being fixed or lessened, people finally had a reason to use Moltres over Zapdos. But this change didn't happen overnight. For most of Gen 9, Zapdos was still dominating the overused tier, and Moltres was stuck in the rarely used tier. And it wasn't until August that Moltres finally became better than Zapdos. So what exactly caused such a big shift to happen? Well, the answer lies in the bans of Articuno and Volcarona from OU. Yes, even though Moltres stayed in the RU tier right after Articuno's ban, this event still helped Moltres be as good as it is today. That's because Articuno was the main Pokemon for Rain teams in OU, and without it, the Rain playstyle has struggled to stay relevant. This gave Moltres a big boost in viability since its worst matchup possible became less common and just not as effective as it used to be. But more interestingly, the Volcarona ban had an even bigger impact, and it's connected to Zamazenta. It sounds strange, but stick with me here. Volcarona was a very broken and very stupid setup sweeper that punished physical attackers with its Flame Body ability. And when Volcarona got banned, physical attackers became pretty deadly since they no longer had to worry about Flame Body, which is where Zamazenta comes into the picture. It replaced Volcarona's role, becoming a Pokemon that could check every physical attacker, but this time Zamazenta did this even better thanks to Iron Defense and Body Press. As players searched for a way to deal with the new threat of Zamazenta, they found an unexpected answer: Moltres. Like Volcarona, Moltres can check almost every physical attacker due to its Flame Body ability. Also, Moltres' extra defensive bulk helps it keep up with physical attackers like Kingambit and Zamazenta even when they're not burned. This is crucial because Flame Body only has a 30% chance to activate, meaning Moltres often has to survive multiple hits before the burn happens. But Moltres isn't just good against physical attackers, it also does well into OU's special attackers too, something Zamazenta, its competition, struggles to do. For example, Dragon Bolt doesn't do enough damage with Dragon Darts and can't use Hex effectively because Moltres is immune to Will-O-Wisp. Iron Valiant also can't do much to Moltres without Thunderbolt, and even with it, Moltres can still win the 1v1 by using Terra Fairy. Gholdengo also struggles to beat a specially defensive Moltres unless it uses the Terra mechanic. All of this shows that Moltres is one of OU's best defensive Pokemon, and many top defensive teams are taking advantage of its advantages. Which I'm curious, comment down below if you've been using Moltres on your OU teams. But anyways, while Moltres is at its peak in the OU tier, on the other hand, Zapdos is going through one of its worst moments in OU history. Besides the atrocity that is Black and White OU, where this ugly blue dinosaur took its place and was never seen ever again. Zapdos is suffering from power creep, or at least something close to it. Zapdos has always relied on its solid defensive stats to switch into other Pokemon because it doesn't have any moves to make opponents do less damage. A Pokemon that does this is something like Corviknight, who has Iron Defense, allowing it to handle Kingambit more consistently. Yet Zapdos just lacks this kind of utility. Its best trick is spreading paralysis, which doesn't stop opponents from dealing heavy damage. Still though, Zapdos' strong defense has kept it competitive for years, but in Scarlet and Violet there's just not enough anymore to stand up to the new powerhouses like Ogerpon Wellspring or Kingambit. In contrast, Moltres does have tools to reduce damage output, such as Will-O-Wisp or Flame Body Burns, making Moltres the more desirable defensive Pokemon. But even offensively, Zapdos is falling behind as the base 100 speed isn't very impressive in Gen 9 OU. There's so many fast Pokemon that either have priority moves, great natural speed, or booster energy speed. So now Zapdos' speed advantage over Moltres isn't very notable. The second problem Zapdos faces in the metagame is the increased counterplay to paralysis. Many Pokemon in the tier like to use Terra Ground to increase the power of Earthquake or to use Terra Blast Ground for Terra Blast coverage. This just so happens to give Pokemon an immunity to discharge, which is really bad for Zapdos trying to spread paralysis. But to add insult to injury, Garganacl hard walls Zapdos, and it can't even get paralyzed because of the Purifying Salt's ability. In fact, the same can be said for Gliscor, who can't get paralyzed from making contact with Zapdos, which leads to my final point on why Zapdos is struggling: the rampant amount of ground types in the tier. Just to name them, there is Clodsire, Landorus Therian, Gliscor, Great Tusk, Tinglu, Iron Treads, and even less common but still used ground types like Excadrill on Sand teams or Ursaluna on Trick Room teams. Scarlet and Violet's OU tier has more viable ground types than ever before. Really bad news for Zapdos' viability. Sure, Zapdos can deal decent damage to some of these Pokemon, but Hurricane's 70% accuracy is too unreliable. Plus, most of the Pokemon can threaten Zapdos much more than Hurricane threatens them. Clodsire and Gliscor can use Toxic, Great Tusk can hit hard with Ice Spinner, especially with Terra Ice, and Landorus hits with a super effective Stone Edge. These Pokemon just make life in OU very difficult for Zapdos. But on the other hand, Moltres can burn all of these Pokemon, which goes to highlight Moltres' utility right now in comparison to Zapdos.